It starts before dawn. Cold air. A stone chamber. Her ladies open a small pot and begin to work. Inside that pot sits Venetian ceruse, lead ground into vinegar until it becomes a thick white paste. They spread it across her face, one careful layer over another, filling the craters that smallpox left behind. This was not vanity. It was construction. The paste turned a scarred woman into a symbol, a sheet of brilliant white that erased age, erased weakness, erased the human being underneath. But the lead was hiding more than old scars. Under that mask, flesh was breaking down, and the women who painted her knew it. They were guarding a secret that could crack a kingdom. Elizabeth the Throne of England was decaying from the inside, and everyone close enough to see it had agreed to say nothing. The thing eating her was not a blade, not poison slipped in by a Spanish agent. It was white. It was crystalline. It was sweet. Sugar. In Elizabethan England, sugar was not a treat. It was wealth, as costly as rare spice, hauled in from lands her fleets had only begun to reach. Owning it was a boast. Eating it constantly was something else. She could not stop. The court saw the show. Towering sugar castles and sugar dragons wheeled out at banquets, glittering under candlelight. Her ladies saw the rest, the hand that slipped again and again into the comfit box, the jaw working on candied fruit through long council meetings. Sugar was her comfort and her ruin. Her mouth was the first thing it took. This is not a story about rotten teeth. That is too small a word for what nearly happened. This is the story of the quietest conspiracy in the Tudor court. For decades, the people closest to Elizabeth kept a silence that held a nation together. They understood one thing they could never speak aloud. If the Queen could feel pain, the Queen could die. And a queen with no husband, no child, and no named heir who could die was a queen whose enemies were already counting the days. Her body failing was a signal, a green light for chaos, a moment to tear England open. Before we lift this mask, tell us which city and country you're watching from in the comments below. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be told, take 1 second to subscribe and support the project. You're watching Ancestral, the best dark history channel in the world. Elizabeth grew up watching a warning made of flesh. Her father. She remembered Henry VIII's court, a place where eating was performance and appetite was policy. He did not simply dine. He tore into the world. Banquets were battlefields. Whole swans, roasted and stitched back into their own feathers, carried through halls thick with torch smoke. Slabs of venison, boar, and beef hacked apart on tables that groaned under the load. Wine and ale poured not from bottles, but from barrels, soaking the rushes on the floor. The scale is documented. At Hampton Court, the royal kitchens ran through around 8,200 sheep, 2,300 deer, and more than 1,000 oxen in a single year. 600 people fed twice daily. The kitchens covered thousands of square feet, fires roaring in enormous hearths, where boys turned spits until their skin blistered. Cooks worked half-naked in the heat. Some men reportedly ordered to stop working nude only by royal decree. Smoke, grease, and the reek of butchered meat soaked into the stone. That smell never left. At the center sat the king. Growing wider by the season, his body a record of every hunger he had ever fed. As a young man, he had jousted, hunted, and danced for days. By the end, his waist measured close to 54 inches. His leg wept from an ulcer that would not close, first opened, some believe, in a jousting fall at Greenwich in January 1536 that knocked him out for 2 hours. Physicians packed the wound and burned it with hot irons to keep it draining. The stink of it was buried under clouds of costly perfume. His gluttony was a message. It said one thing: I can swallow the world, and my body will hold it all. It was a lie. His body was collapsing under the weight of his own myth. When he died at Whitehall in January 1547, he had grown too heavy to walk, moved through the corridors on a mechanical chair worked by servants. Elizabeth was 13. She watched. She learned. Her sister taught her too. She watched Mary I, starved for a Catholic heir, convince herself and a whole kingdom that she carried a child. In late 1554, the court prepared. Cradles were readied and hung with rich cloth. In April 1555, at Hampton Court, letters were drafted announcing the birth of a prince, blank spaces waiting only for the day and the hour. Midwives and nurses stood by. Bonfires were laid, ready to light. Mary's belly swelled. She felt movement, or thought she did. She sat for weeks in a darkened room, waiting. There was no child. A tumor, perhaps, or hope so desperate it took physical form. The physicians revised the date, then revised it again. May passed. June passed. By August, the court dispersed in silence, no one willing to say the word aloud. Then it happened again the following year. The same false swelling, the same waiting, the same silence. Mary's body had betrayed her in front of everyone, twice, and delivered nothing but shame. Her husband, Philip of Spain, left the country and did not return. Elizabeth, the Protestant heir, stood at the edge of that disaster and took the lesson to heart. For a monarch, and above all a woman on the throne, the body is not private. It is territory. Its aches, its failures, its cravings are affairs of state. Whoever controls the body controls the story. When Mary died in November 1558, Elizabeth was at Hatfield. The story goes she was reading beneath an oak in the park when the riders came with the news. She was 25. She knelt in the cold grass and spoke a line from the Psalms in Latin. This is the Lord's doing, and it is marvelous in our eyes. So began a reign of iron restraint. In public, she barely ate. A little wine, watered heavily, a slice of meat, a piece of bread. Every meal measured and calm. She made herself the opposite of her father's excess and her sister's ruin. A queen ruled by reason, not by hunger. That was the first layer of the lie. Behind the curtain, a secret current of sugar had already begun to run. To understand why it mattered, you have to know where it came from. In the 1560s and 1570s, it arrived through the ports of Antwerp and Lisbon, refined from cane grown on the Atlantic islands of Madeira and São Tomé, worked by enslaved hands whose labor England pretended not to see. Its price in London markets could run higher than the same weight of some spices. A pound cost more than a laborer earned in a week. Ordinary people never tasted it. To eat it was to eat money. It started as strategy. Foreign ambassadors and visiting lords were fed banquets where the showpiece was not the meat. It was the subtleties, sculptures, some taller than a child, built entirely from spun sugar, marzipan, and pastry. Edible propaganda. A sugar fortress modeled on an English stronghold, tiny cannons and all. A Spanish galleon that English nobles smashed apart with their spoons, grinning as they did it. Griffins, dragons, unicorns, chess sets molded in sugar, playing cards, even dishes and cups made of the stuff, so that a guest might eat his own plate at the end of the meal. The men who made these guarded their craft like alchemists. court confectioners boiled and pulled the sugar plate into thread while it cooled, working in heat and secrecy. One slip in temperature, and the whole sculpture slumped into ruin. Recipes circulated in guarded manuscripts, later printed in books like Thomas Dawson's Household Guides and Hugh Platt's Delights for Ladies, but the finest work stayed inside the royal household. When the Duke of Anjou came courting Elizabeth in 1579, the sugarwork grew so lavish that ambassadors wrote home describing it in detail. This was wealth turned into a weapon. It told the Spanish ambassador, Bernardino de Mendoza, and the French envoy that England was rich enough to let its court eat gold. Elizabeth presided over the spectacle with a small, knowing smile. She thought she was wielding sugar. She had no idea it would turn in her hand. The public theater of the subtleties hid a private obsession. The comfit box, a small casket, often finely worked, that never left her side. It traveled with her from the throne room to the privy chamber. Her most trusted ladies were responsible for it. Their duty was simple: keep it full. Always. Chief among them was Blanche Parry, who had known Elizabeth since the Queen was an infant and rocked her cradle. Parry served her for 56 years and kept her jewels and her secrets. When she went blind in old age, Elizabeth kept her close all the same. There was Cat Ashley, the old governess who had taught her to read and had gone to the Tower for her sake in the dangerous years of Mary's reign. There was Mary Radcliffe, sworn to serve and never marry, who guarded the Queen's private rooms into old age. And there was the Countess of Nottingham, whose word, years later, would break Elizabeth's heart over the fate of the Earl of Essex. These women were not servants in any ordinary sense. They dressed her, slept near her, emptied her chamber pot, and knew the shape of her body better than any physician was ever allowed to. Inside the box sat a hoard of sweetness: caraway seeds, coriander, anise, each locked in a hard shell of boiled sugar; candied slices of aringo root, believed to strengthen the body; preserved fruit glistening with syrup. This was her fuel. During the long, grinding sessions of the Privy Council, while ministers like William Cecil and Francis Walsingham argued over war, plots, and Mary Queen of Scots, her hand would drift into the box, a few candied seeds crushed between her teeth. Then a few more, a habit so automatic she barely noticed it, the way another person might chew a nail. That sharp burst of sweetness was a second of relief from the crushing weight of the crown. Her ladies saw it. They watched the box empty and refill, day after day, month after month. They were the first to witness where the rot began. The keepers of the Queen's hidden appetite. They were managing something that did not yet have a name. The strange part is what enabled it: the Crown's own paranoia. Fear of poison was no vague worry in the Tudor court. It was a daily calculation built on real blood. Walsingham's spy network uncovered the Ridolfi plot in 1571 and unraveled the Babington plot in 1586, both aimed at Elizabeth's life. In 1584, her Dutch ally, William of Orange, was shot dead in his own house by an assassin. Physicians close to the Queen were later accused of plotting to poison her, and one, Rodrigo Lopez, would hang for it in 1594. Everyone at court knew a single disloyal cook could end a dynasty. So Elizabeth's public meals were wrapped in rituals so heavy that eating became nearly impossible. A German traveler named Paul Hentzner visited her court at Greenwich around 1598 and wrote it all down, stunned by what he saw. A gentleman entered carrying a rod. Behind him, another man with a tablecloth. They knelt 3 times, knees cracking on the boards, before laying the cloth on the table. Then, an unmarried lady, he noted, and after her, a married countess, came forward and rubbed the plates with bread and salt. a test to catch poison smeared on the dishes. She knelt too. Finally, the yeomen of the guard, tall men in scarlet, filed in carrying 24 gold and silver dishes. A taster bit from every single one, and gave a mouthful to each guard who had carried it, in case the food was foul. 12 trumpets and 2 kettle drums sounded through the hall. Hentzner wrote, loud enough to shake the room. And the throne was empty. The queen was not even present. When the meal was ready, unmarried ladies carried the dishes into her private chamber, where she chose in solitude what she would actually eat, and what was left went to the ladies of her household. The whole outer performance was for show, a security ritual so elaborate that actually eating during it was out of the question. It was designed to impress, to prove the queen's life was guarded by walls of loyalty no assassin could breach. Its real effect was different. It drove her true eating into hiding. She took her real meals alone, or with only a handful of trusted ladies. There, away from the tasters and the kneeling servants, she ate what she wanted. The comfit box opened. The sweet wine flowed. Sugared meats and fruit tarts vanished with no one to judge her. The system built to save her from a fast death by poison created the perfect place for a slow death by decay. The walls that kept the assassins out locked her in with her own compulsion. The quiet of the privy chamber was the sound of a queen's teeth beginning to fail, and her ladies were the only ones who could hear it. They were trapped inside the lie with her, guardians of a truth that could not be spoken. The Virgin Queen, the immortal Gloriana, the icon of Protestant purity. Her image was built on 2 white powders, lead and sugar. The lead deserves its own reckoning. Venetian ceruse was mixed from white lead and vinegar, sometimes with egg white for shine. Applied over skin already scarred, it seeped into the body through the pores. It caused the flesh beneath to gray and crack, which demanded thicker coats to cover the damage, a cycle that fed on itself. Physicians of the age warned that lead-in cosmetics rotted the skin and the teeth alike, though few dared say it to a queen. Some records suggest she wore the paste an inch thick in her later years. The same women who painted it on her face knew what it was doing. One poison for the skin, the other for the bones. Her brush with death came in October 1562 at Hampton Court. Smallpox. She burned with fever for days and lost the power of speech. The council gathered in panic because she had no heir and named none. They argued in the corridors over who would take the throne if she died that night. Some pushed for Lady Catherine Grey, others for the Earl of Huntingdon. Lord Robert Dudley barely left her side, and in her fever, she asked that he be made protector of the realm. Lady Mary Sidney nursed her through it and caught the disease herself. Her face left scarred for the rest of her life so badly she withdrew from court. Elizabeth survived, but the smooth face was gone. The Mask of Ceruse was born from that October. For a while, it held. The public saw only the image. The queen on progress through the summer countryside, blazing in a gown sewn with pearls, greeted by pageants staged by anxious nobles at Kenilworth in 1575, where Robert Dudley spent a fortune on fireworks and floating shows to win her over 19 days. Her voice at Tilbury in August 1588, as the Armada threatened, telling her troops she had the body of a weak and feeble woman, but the heart and stomach of a king. The portraits, approved and controlled, showing a face untouched by time. The rainbow portrait. The Ditchley portrait, where she stands on a map of England with the storm behind her and the sun ahead. A Privy Council order in 1596 even called in unflattering images of the Queen to be burned. All of it painting a woman who did not age. She was building herself into something married to nothing but her kingdom. A living myth, and every corner of her court worked to keep it intact. Her servants knew what lay under the ruff and the farthingale, the toothaches that kept her awake past midnight, the breath she tried to smother with cloves and scented water, the gaps opening in her smile that she learned to hide by keeping her lips closed and turning her cheek to the light. They were the only ones who lived in the gap between the woman and the monument. They patched the cracks, hid the stains, held the perfect face in place while they watched her, one day at a time, eating herself alive. If you are the kind of person who knows history is not a list of dates, but a chain of brutal human stories, then you already belong here. This channel is more than a place to watch. It is a gathering for people who want the truth with nothing sanded off. By joining the Lineage, our membership club, you stop being just a viewer. You become a patron of this work. You join the inner circle that keeps these investigations alive and lets these stories be told with the depth they deserve. You get early access to our documentaries and other perks, but more than that, you become part of the team. You make sure these dark histories are never buried. If you are one of us, click the join button and take your place in the ranks. Here is the trouble with a secret. It is alive. It has to be fed. It has to be guarded. And it always wants out. For years, Elizabeth's ladies were flawless jailers. They staged her appearances. They sweetened her breath. They listened to her pained complaints in the dark and said nothing. They were partners in the most vital plot of the age, protecting the Queen's physical authority in a kingdom where her death without an heir meant civil war, foreign invasion, and the possible return of Catholic rule under a Spanish hand. But the decay in her mouth did not negotiate. It could not be bargained with or crushed. It spread from tooth to tooth, a slow black tide of infection. By the 1570s, the pain was constant. There was no dentistry worth the name. To pull a tooth meant a barber surgeon with iron pincers and no way to dull the agony. Elizabeth feared it so much that when a bad tooth had to come out, a bishop reportedly let his own be pulled first to show her it could be survived. So she endured it, and the rot deepened, and her ladies watched the black creep across what was left of her smile. They were holding a mask of perfection together, and they could feel the pressure rising behind it. A crack was coming. Someone was going to get close enough to see through it and find the rot beneath. And they had no idea the man who would tear the secret open was already on the road. A curious German named Paul Hentzner, riding for England with a sharp eye and a pen that spared nothing. He would stand before the Queen, watch her lips as she spoke, and write down for all of Europe the one thing her ladies had spent 40 years hiding. The year is 1598. A German named Paul Hentzner has talked his way into a spot at the English court. He is a lawyer from Silesia, traveling as tutor to a young nobleman named Christopher Rediger, keeping notes on everything he sees. He has come to watch the Queen dine at Greenwich, to witness the ceremony with his own eyes. Greenwich Palace sat on the south bank of the Thames, red brick running along the water, the river carrying barges, and the shouts of boatmen up to its windows. It was Elizabeth's birthplace. She had been born there in September 1533, in the room they called the Chamber of the Virgins. Now she returned to it as something the country half believed to be more than mortal. He sees the procession, the kneeling, the tasting, the rod, the tablecloth, the 24 dishes carried in by scarlet guards while trumpets and kettle drums shook the walls. Then the Queen enters. She is 65. He cannot look away. Her wig is a red blaze pinned with pearls. Her gown stands around her like a structure. Silk and silver thread stiffened until it holds its own shape in the air. Hentzner counted the details for his diary. A small crown on her head, a necklace of gold and gems reaching to her waist, her hands thin, her fingers narrow, rings crowding the knuckles. Her bosom, he noted, worn uncovered, as English women wore it until they married. Her face, a flawless white plain. This is Gloriana, the Virgin Queen, the icon 40 years in the making. Then she speaks. She turns to address an official, and for one moment, the illusion slips. Hentzner looks straight into her open mouth. What he sees goes into his travel diary, printed years later and read across Europe. Her teeth, he writes, are yellow and uneven. Then he adds the line that matters. On the left side, they are black. And he offers a cause. He blames it, he says, on the English and their too great use of sugar. That was not court gossip. That was a leak with a diagnosis attached. Hentzner swore no oath. He owed the crown nothing. He was a chronicler passing through, and his words would ride back across the channel in merchant letters and diplomatic pouches. For the first time, the thing hidden inside the privy chamber walked out into daylight. The rot was on the record, and so was its source. Consider who was reading. The spies of Philip II of Spain, who had launched the Armada against her 10 years before and sent 2 more fleets in 1596 and 1597, both scattered by storms. The agents of the Pope, who had excommunicated her in 1570 with the bull Regnans in Excelsis and told her subjects it was no sin to remove her. To them, a decaying royal mouth was not a matter of vanity. It was a reading of the kingdom itself. A queen whose body was visibly failing was a queen whose grip might be failing too. Black teeth were a crack in the armor of the state. And England had no named heir behind her to fill the gap. James of Scotland waited in the north, and Robert Cecil had already opened a secret correspondence with him. But Elizabeth would not speak his name aloud, because to name a successor was to sign her own irrelevance. The people who had spent decades guarding the secret now faced the same problem. The truth was moving, and they could not call it back. Understand why she would not simply fix it. Her dread was not weakness. It was arithmetic. There was no dentistry as we would know it. There were barber surgeons, organized in London under the Company of Barbers, which had merged with the surgeons by royal charter under her father in 1540. The painter Holbein made the picture that marked that union, Henry seated with the charter held out across a crowded room of kneeling men. These were men who cut hair, lanced boils, set broken arms, and pulled teeth with the same hands. Their tools came from the same forges that made horseshoes and armor. The main instrument was the pelican, an iron claw hooked under the tooth. There was also the tooth key and the plain pincer, the forceps that crushed as often as they gripped. The surgeon braced against the jaw and levered the root out with a twist. No anesthetic, a mouthful of strong drink, if you were fortunate, or a paste of henbane smeared on the gum, which did little. Assistants held the patient down by the shoulders and the head. The sound stayed with everyone who heard it. A wet crack, as the root tore free of the bone. Sometimes the tooth shattered and left splinters buried in the gum to fester. Sometimes the jaw itself broke. An abscess that burst inward could carry infection to the blood or the brain and kill within days. Some believed a worm lived inside the aching tooth and gnawed it hollow, and healers would smoke the mouth with henbane seed over a flame to drive the worm out, showing the patient the little white threads that fell to the floor. They were only the burst seed casings. The pain was not a sting. It was a wave that dropped grown men unconscious. Now, put the queen in that chair, held down, bleeding, crying out in front of witnesses. It was unthinkable. Her whole reign stood on the idea that she could not be broken. She had told Parliament she was married to her kingdom and would need no other husband. She had stood at Tilbury in 1588 and claimed the heart of a king inside a woman's body. To be seen defeated by a tooth was to be seen as defeatable by anything. So for years, she simply bore it. She chewed on the good side. She hid the smell behind cloves and scented water, and the marjoram she kept about her, and the rosewater her ladies distilled in the still room. She cleaned her teeth with a cloth and a paste of sugar and honey, the very things destroying them, on the advice of the physicians of the age who thought sweetness scoured decay away. She carried the throb that beat behind her eyes and ran down into her neck. Her ladies caught the flinch, the hand flying to her jaw when she thought no one watched. They heard her groan in her sleep. She turned away every barber they offered. The cure frightened her more than the disease, but infection does not wait. The ache became a fixture. It bled into her temper, her sleep, her judgment. Foreign envoys noted her moods swinging without warning. The sharp words, the sudden silences, the way she would rap out an order and then forget she had given it. Her counselors saw it. Men like Robert Cecil, the small hunchbacked son of her old minister William Cecil, whom she called her pygmy behind his back, understood a plain truth. The Queen's body was the nation's body, and the nation's body was in pain. Something had to give. The answer came as an act of loyalty so strange it survived the centuries. John Aylmer was Bishop of London. He had once been tutor to Lady Jane Grey, the girl who ruled 9 days and lost her head at 17. He had fled abroad under Mary and written pamphlets defending the right of women to rule. He was old now, near 70, no stranger to the aches of age. He watched the Queen suffer and knew that no argument would move her. Her fear was too deep for words, so he chose to answer it with his own blood. Before the Queen and her physicians, Aylmer announced that he too had a bad tooth. He said the pain of pulling it was less than Her Majesty feared, and easier still for an old man with few teeth left to lose. Then he sat in the chair. He opened his mouth, and he ordered the Queen's own surgeon to draw one of his sound teeth. She watched the iron claw go in. She heard the crack of the root. She saw the blood run down the old man's chin and pool in the creases of his neck, dark against the white of his linen. And she saw that he made no sound. He did not faint. He gripped the arms of the chair and endured it in silence. When it was done, he spat into a basin, wiped his mouth, and rose from the chair as if he had done nothing more than sneeze. It worked. Shamed and steadied by what an old bishop had done to himself, Elizabeth finally sat down in the chair. The fight to save her health had turned bloody. Aylmer died a few years later in 1594, his sacrifice largely forgotten by all but the men who had stood in that room. But the daily work of the cover-up never belonged to the council. It belonged to the women of the bedchamber. Blanche Parry had served her since she was a princess and had rocked her cradle in Wales. She kept the Queen's books and jewels and died in 1590 after 56 years of service, buried with honor at Westminster. Cat Ashley had taught her to read and gone to the Tower for her sake. There was Mary Radcliffe, who never married so she could serve, the Countess of Warwick, and Lady Mary Scudamore. They were more than attendants. They were her guard, her confessors, her partners in the deception. They slept on pallets in her chamber and kept a lit candle burning through the night. They dressed her in the layers that took the better part of an hour. The smock, the stockings gartered above the knee, the farthingale that swung her skirts wide. The bodice stiffened with whalebone until she could barely bend. The sleeves pinned on one by one. They saw the real body every morning and every night, and they staged the monument that the world was allowed to see. When extraction left gaps in her smile, they gave her wads of fine cloth to pack into her cheeks so her face would not cave inward. When her jawline sagged, they chose gowns with tall, starched ruffs, stiffened with the yellow starch newly fashionable from the Low Countries, and set on wire frames called support asses that climbed to her ears and framed the face while hiding the neck. On days when the pain was too great, they declared the queen indisposed and kept the ambassadors and petitioners waiting in the presence chamber, where the crowd would murmur and shuffle for hours under the tapestries before being told to go home. They inventoried her jewels and gowns against theft and controlled who came near, so that even her own godson, Sir John Harrington, had to write ahead and beg an audience. They managed her like a campaign, and every morning they built the mask with their own hands. The Venetian ceruse was the heart of it, sold by apothecaries and imported at cost from Italy. They ground the white lead into vinegar and egg white until it made a thick plaster, then spread it across her face, her neck, her hands, and her chest above the bodice, an even white surface that swallowed the smallpox scars and the marks of age. Over it they sometimes glazed a wash of egg white to give the sheen the fashion of the day called the glassy look, a coat that cracked if she smiled too wide. Then a red made from cochineal or madder for the lips, and a touch of the cheeks, and drops of belladonna in the eyes to widen the pupils and make her gaze bright and dark. In the torchlight of the great hall it worked. From a distance she looked carved from marble, untouched by time. The cost was hidden in the paste. Lead is a poison that works through the skin over years. It dries the flesh, wrinkles it, turns it gray, which forces a thicker coat to hide the harm the last coat caused. Removing the mask each night with a wash that often held mercury or more lead only stripped the skin thinner. It thins the hair, a loss she covered with the red wigs she owned in number, said to be around 80 by the end, some curled and set with hot irons by her women each morning. It reaches the gut, the nerves, the mind. It brings on the sour temper and the cramping stomach and the trembling hand. The belladonna clouded her sight over the years until she squinted at papers held close to her face, the very things her ladies used to preserve the picture of her health were quietly dismantling the woman underneath. Every morning, out of loyalty, they painted poison onto the face of their queen to save her crown. They kept the monument standing by corroding the person inside it. Everything you are hearing was pulled together from first-hand accounts, diplomatic letters, and court records. The single best source, the book that anchored this whole investigation, is a full archive of Tudor life and its buried secrets. We have made that exact volume available to you right now. Look for the View Products button on your screen. One tap opens a door straight into the world you are hearing about. Owning it is closer to holding the evidence than reading a summary. If you want to understand how this deception actually worked, put this book on your shelf. And while you are there, look at the rest. We have gathered a collection of dark memorabilia, artifacts made to bring this age within reach. Open the shop shelf now, browse the relics, and grab the book that started it all. You can do it while the story keeps moving. The lead was killing the skin. The sugar was killing the bone. The silence still held, but the price kept climbing. Her ladies were now fighting on two fronts at once, the rot from within and the rot from the remedy without, holding up a body that was buckling under its own cures. The queen sat trapped in the middle of that equation. She had built her power on the promise that she would never age, never fail, married to her people and immune to time. She had made her body into a symbol of the realm itself, a virgin state that no foreign king could enter or command. It had worked beyond anyone's hope. It had held a country together through decades of religious blood, through the burnings under her sister and the plots under her own rule, through the execution of Mary Queen of Scots in 1587 that she signed and then claimed she had never meant to send. It had stared down the Spanish Armada in 1588, when the beacons blazed hill to hill along the coast and the bells rang out for the storm that broke the Spanish fleet. It had made a golden age of Shakespeare, Drake, and Spenser, whose fairy queen had turned her into a goddess in verse and won him £50 a year from her purse. Now the myth wanted payment. In flesh, her own. The mask of Gloriana had fused to her face and begun to eat what lay beneath. The court began to notice the change even through the paint. In 1597, the French ambassador André Urol de Metz was granted an audience and wrote it all down without mercy. Her face, he said, was long and thin, her teeth yellow and uneven, many of them gone, so that when she spoke quickly, one could not follow her words. He noticed, too, that she kept opening the front of her gown as if she were too hot, showing the wrinkled skin of her chest, and that she toyed with it as she talked, sometimes letting it fall open to the waist. The illusion was thinning like the skin under the ceruse, and now the men sent to weigh England's strength were writing home about a queen who was visibly coming apart. And the women who had built the lie had no way out but to keep sealing the cracks. They felt, with a cold certainty they never spoke aloud, the whole structure starting to give way beneath their hands. What none of them yet knew was how the end would come. Not in a battle. Not by an assassin's blade, but in a room at Richmond Palace, over a single refusal, when the Queen would order the cushions laid on the floor and stand on her feet for days, and would not lie down, and would not eat, and would not let anyone near her, until the body they had guarded for 40 years finally stopped. By the turn of the century, the lie was wearing thin. The towering gowns, the whalebone and wire, the wigs that burned like a low sun, all of it was still in place. But now it propped up a ghost. In 1597, the French ambassador André Urol de Metz arrived at Whitehall. He had come to negotiate over the war with Spain and the fate of the Low Countries. He also came to meet a legend, the Queen who had broken the Armada and outlived every plot against her. He was led through the long galleries hung with portraits of that same Queen, young and painted and eternal, and then into her presence. He saw the white mask, the fire of the jewels, the small crown set on the red wig. Then she spoke, and like Hentzner before him, he looked past the show and saw the woman underneath. His dispatches to Henri IV spared nothing. He called her gaunt and frail. When she opened her mouth, he wrote, her teeth were very black, and he added that many were missing, so that when she spoke fast, a foreigner could not follow her at all. He watched her open the front of her gown again and again, as if the room stifled her, showing the wrinkled skin beneath. She looked, he concluded, like someone already turned toward the grave. But that was not the whole of it. De Metz also saw the mind still burning inside the ruin. Her eyes flashed when her temper rose. She spoke to him in Italian, in French, in Latin, switching tongues to prove the machine still ran. During one outburst, the story goes, she seized a rusty sword and drove it into a tapestry on the wall. The old lioness had not gone anywhere. Yet between the flashes came long silences, stretches where she seemed to drift into some private dark. This was the news that traveled home in the diplomatic bags. Elizabeth of England was breaking down. The icon was crumbling. And for a country with no named heir, a crumbling queen was a signal to every ambitious man in Europe. The silence her ladies and her council kept was no longer about her pride. It had become the last wall standing between England and civil war. Every day she stayed upright, every day the picture of her strength held, was one more day the kingdom did not tear itself open. That fear had a name no one would say out loud: the succession. Elizabeth had refused for her entire reign to name who came after her. To name an heir, she believed, was to dig her own grave while she still breathed. She had told Parliament she would not have her winding sheet held up before her eyes while she yet lived. It would build a second throne for restless men to gather around while she ruled. For decades, the refusal was genius. It kept her enemies guessing and her courtiers bound to her alone. Now, it was a lit fuse. Who would take the crown? James VI of Scotland, the Protestant son of the cousin she had sent to the block at Fotheringhay in 1587, Mary Queen of Scots. A Catholic claimant with Spanish gold behind him, perhaps the Infanta Isabella, whom Philip II had pushed as a candidate before his own death in 1598? Or would the great families fall on each other in a scramble that dragged England back to the butchery of the Wars of the Roses, the memory of which still hung over every Tudor throne? A Jesuit named Robert Persons had already printed a book abroad, laying out a dozen rival claimants, and the very reading of it was made treason. The Queen's failing body was now a threat to the survival of the state itself. There had already been a warning. In February 1601, the Earl of Essex, once her favorite, the young man she had indulged, and then broken after his failure in Ireland, marched through the streets of London with some 200 armed men, trying to raise the city against her council. He shouted that his enemies meant to sell England to Spain. The city did not rise. The doors stayed shut. Essex was taken, tried in Westminster Hall, and beheaded within the walls of the Tower on the 25th of February, the last man Elizabeth ever sent to the block. The executioner needed 3 strokes to finish the work, and the crowd groaned at each one. She was said to have carried a ring afterward, and to have wept for him alone in her chamber, playing at the virginals in the dark. The rising had failed, but it had shown everyone how thin the ground was. Ambition was already moving while she still lived. Her council understood it best. Robert Cecil, the small, hunched son of her old minister, William Cecil, was already writing in secret to James in the north, smoothing the road, arranging the handover in cipher, using numbers in place of names so the letters could not be read if they were intercepted. James was numbered 30, Cecil himself 10. He signed with a figure, not a signature. He was planning her afterlife while she still breathed. A quiet betrayal, and a necessary one, to save the thing she had built. Had she known of those letters, it would have been treason and the block. She did not know. In March 1603, the end began. She fell ill at Richmond Palace, the riverside house she called the warm winter box of her old age, west of London on the Thames. The winter had been hard and wet. She had lost old friends in quick succession. Her cousin and closest woman, the Countess of Nottingham, had died in late February, and Elizabeth sank into grief after it, refusing food and company, sitting for hours without speaking. She would not change her clothes. Her physicians examined her. She waved them off. She refused their medicines. And she refused, above all, to go to bed. For days, she would not lie down. She stood, or she sat propped on cushions heaped on the floor of her privy chamber, one finger pressed to her lips, her eyes open and fixed on nothing. Her ladies spread more cushions and knelt beside her, taking turns through the nights, laying out fresh linen she would not use. Her counselors pleaded. "Rest," they said. "Save your strength." She would not move. Robert Cecil pressed her, telling her she must go to bed to content the people. She turned on him with the last of her fire. The word must, she said, was not used to princes. Little man, she told him, thy father would not have dared say so much, but thou hast grown presumptuous because thou knowest I shall die. A dread had taken hold of her that no reasoning could shift. She had become certain that if she lay down, she would never rise again. To take to the bed was to surrender, and surrender was the one thing she had never done. Not to Spain, not to Rome, not to the men who had plotted her death for 45 years. Her secretary, Robert Carey, who came to see her, later wrote that he found her in one of her withdrawing rooms sitting low among the cushions, and that she took his hand and wrung it, and sighed the words, "No, Robin, I am not well." She fetched, he said, more than 40 or 50 great sighs. Some at court whispered that she saw visions in those days, her own body wasted in a looking-glass, a pale figure standing at the foot of the room. Her fool could not make her laugh. Musicians played in the next chamber, soft airs on the lute and the virginals, and she did not stir. She asked at one point for a true glass, not the flattering ones her ladies had held before her for 20 years, and when she saw her real face in it, they said she cursed everyone who had lied to her about her looks. So she stood, hour after hour, day after day, a woman near 70 holding herself upright by will alone, on cushions on the cold floor, refusing the bed and refusing the physicians, while her court watched her die on her feet. She had spent her whole life making her body stand for the realm. Now, in her failing mind, the logic held to the last. If she lay down, England fell. So she did not lie down. Her throat swelled shut. An abscess, some later thought, or the long poison in her blood finally reaching its account. She could no longer swallow. She lost the power of speech. She spoke now only with her hands, thin fingers shaping signs in the air of the darkened chamber, the fire low, the windows shuttered against the river cold, the room heavy with the smell of herbs burned to sweeten it. The Privy Council closed in around her. The hour they had feared for years had arrived, and they still had no name written down. They pressed her one last time. They asked, so the accounts run, whether she would have the King of France. She gave no sign. They named others. Then they spoke of the King of Scotland. Her hand rose and drew a circle above her head. A crown. Some who were there swore it happened just so. Others said she was past all sign by then, and the council simply agreed among themselves what she had meant, that they read the answer they needed into the last movement of a dying hand. Either way, Cecil had his answer, and it was enough. At last, her women lifted her from the cushions to the bed. Whether she truly consented or simply had no strength left to resist, no one recorded honestly. John Whitgift, Archbishop of Canterbury, the man she called her little black husband, knelt at her side. His old knees ached on the boards, and he tried to rise more than once, and each time she gripped his hand and would not let him go. So he stayed down and prayed until his legs failed under him. She lay with her eyes shut and her breath growing shallow. When he spoke of the joys of heaven, they said, she pressed his hand. Then she slipped past speech and past sign into sleep. The mask was gone. The ceruse washed from her face. The wigs set aside. The great gowns folded into their chests. gowns numbered in the thousands by the end of her life, silk and cloth of gold packed away in the dark. What lay on the bed was not Gloriana, not the Virgin Queen, not the goddess of 100 controlled portraits. It was a small, worn, dying woman with thin white hair and a hollow face. The performance of 45 years had reached its end. In the small hours of the 24th of March, 1603, between 2 and 3 in the morning, she died in her sleep. They said she went mildly, like a ripe apple from the tree, the fight in her finally spent. She was 69, and she had ruled for 44 years and 4 months. The Tudor line died with her in that bed. The silence was over. The work of the silent was not. Before her body had cooled, Cecil set the plan running. Sir Robert Carey, brother to the dead Countess of Nottingham, had waited near the palace for exactly this. He threw himself onto a horse and rode north for Edinburgh without stopping for rest, changing mounts at every post house, riding through the day and into the night. He fell once and took a kick to the head from his own horse that left him bloodied down the face, and he climbed back on and rode. He covered nearly 400 miles in under 3 days, a ride men spoke of for years. He reached James at Holyrood late on the night of the 26th, was brought up to the king's chamber caked in mud and blood, knelt, and hailed him King of England. He carried a sapphire ring as proof, one James recognized, drawn from the dead queen's finger by the Countess of Scrope through a window on a cord to her waiting brother below. Back in London, the council moved as one. The ports were watched and the roads guarded. The councillors and heralds rode to the cross at Cheapside and to the gates of Whitehall and proclaimed James King of England, France, and Ireland while the city was still waking, the criers reading the words to crowds pressing in the March cold, the trumpets sounding over the rooftops. Bonfires were lit that night, and church bells rang. There was no scramble, no war, no return to the old butchery of Lancaster and York. The handover ran smooth because men had spent years in the dark, in cipher, making it run smooth. The last victory of the long conspiracy belonged to her servants. They had held the mask in place just long enough. They had hidden the black teeth, managed the pain, painted over the ruin with lead, packed her cheeks with cloth, and propped her upright until the final hour, buying the kingdom the days it needed to change hands without a single sword drawn in the street. They had saved England from itself, and history mostly forgot their names. Blanche Parry was already dead, Cat Ashley long gone. The women who had knelt on the cushions beside her in that last week faded out of the record almost entirely. Their service ended with a sovereign who no longer needed them. Her body was opened and embalmed, then carried by barge down the Thames at night from Richmond to Whitehall, torches burning along the black water, the oars dipping in silence past the sleeping riverbanks. She lay in state for weeks. There was a story, told by one of her ladies who kept watch, that in the night the sealed coffin split open with a sound like a gun going off, the swollen body inside forcing the lid apart, so that the watchers ran from the room. On the 28th of April, they bore her to Westminster Abbey through streets packed shoulder to shoulder, the houses hung with black. Her waxen effigy lay atop the coffin, painted and robed and crowned, the mask made permanent one final time, so that the crowd saw Gloriana and not the woman. The chronicler John Stowe, who stood in those streets, wrote that when the people beheld the image drawn along, there was such a general sighing, groaning, and weeping as the like had never been seen or known in the memory of man. 4 horses draped in black drew the hearse. James, riding south to claim her throne, did not attend her funeral. She was laid at last in a vault at Westminster, and years later her successor, set her sister Mary beside her under one monument. Two queens who had spent their lives at odds, folded into a single grave. The story of Elizabeth's teeth is not a footnote in the history of medicine. It is a measure of what absolute power costs the body that holds it. To build the legend of an ageless virgin queen, to hold a fractured nation together through decades of religious war and Spanish threat, she consented to the slow ruin of her own flesh. She turned her most loyal women into agents of both her survival and her decay. They painted poison on her to hide the scars of disease. They fed the habit that hollowed her from within, refilling the comfit box to the last. They held up her failing frame and buried her agony from the world, all in service of a myth she had made, and they had sworn to keep. The rot in her mouth was never a private weakness. It was a payment, the price of a golden age, settled in nerve and lead and bone. She had told her subjects she was married to England, and in the end, England took everything a marriage could take: her face, her health, her body. And it left behind a legend that never aged, because the woman who carried it had already paid the whole cost in flesh. Thank you for staying with this story to its end. If you believe history is more than a list of names and dates, that these hard human truths deserve to be remembered, then subscribe to Ancestral. Like this video and send it to one person who needs to see what power really takes from those who hold it. You've just watched another premium documentary by Ancestral, your ultimate history hub on YouTube. The story does not end here. The video now opening on your screen is the next chapter of your descent into the past. Click it. Watch it now. Keep going.